in structural ways, Europe is weaker than it's been compared to the United States, probably since the 1950s.
Today's guest is Steven Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times in Europe. Over 4 decades, Steven has reported from more than 120 countries, serving as bureau chief in cities from Moscow to Jerusalem to London to Bangkok. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist known for his sharp insights on Russia and the shifting balance of power across Europe and beyond.
This is Conversation Changers, brought to you by Salzburg Global.
Steven, welcome to Conversation Changers. You have been dedicating the past years to transatlantic relations. That's certainly part of your beat. Tell me, have you ever seen anything quite like what we're witnessing in the past years?
No, not at all. I mean, partly it's because in structural ways, Europe is weaker than it's been compared to the United States, probably since the 1950s. In the 50s, Europe was doing better, the sort of 30 glorious years, etc. But now I think the size and the economy and the wealth of the United States and the declining growth per capita of the European Union, I think, really is beginning to tell. That's one thing. And then you have the personality of Donald Trump, which is quite remarkable. I'm sure everyone has their own views. I met him in 1988, before he ever became a politician.
When did you meet him? What was the occasion?
Well, I was just joined the New York Times. I had been in London for the Boston Globe, and the New York Times hired me. And I was spending a year doing all kinds of stories before I went abroad for the Times. So that was the deal. I would spend a year running around New York and America and then go abroad. And for July 3rd or 4th of that year, Trump was married to Ivana then. And he invited me and I think one or two others, the New York Times really, and one or two others, to see this yacht he'd bought. And he called it naturally the Trump Princess. Everything had to have Trump on it. So he and Ivana took me around this yacht, and we had to stroke the suede walls and look at the gold taps.
Lots of gold, I assume.
Lots of gold, but less than today. I mean, he was thinner and actually more articulate than he is today. And yet he still, I remember this because I wrote a little story about it, kind of a satirical story, but he was obsessed then about how our allies are screwing us over, and we have too many German and Japanese cars on our streets, and they don't let American cars in, and we're spending all this money to defend these people who aren't grateful and who are not having to spend the money so they can spend it on social welfare. So this has been an obsession for him since 1986.
Long-standing theme.
Absolutely.
And, you can argue there are some things are to this story,
right?
Of
course. No, it's true. And frankly, Americans, ever since Harry Truman, have wanted Europe to do more for its own defense. And Trump, partly by berating people, by humiliating people, by pushing and shoving, by being not one of us in some ways, I think he got more done with the aid of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine to get the Europeans to realize that they needed to contribute more to their own defense, and that the dangers of the world were probably more vivid than just mixing brown glass and green glass and recycling your newspapers.
Right. Well, we started and you began to tell the story of European decline in a way, right? So the economy drifted apart. And I think I saw a statistic the other day that in 2008, European economy and US economy were pretty much on par. And then in the last some 20 years, there's a huge change. The United States goes up, and Europe hardly improves. So there's a huge gap now.
And I think it's a big problem. Now, part of it, you can say, was the enlargement of the European Union to Eastern countries that were poorer. But frankly, you look at Poland, Poland's doing great. I mean, the Polish economy is doing better than the French economy, right? I mean, so it's not just about enlargement. I mean, it is to some degree. You have in Europe, too, a bit of the MAGA movement that says too much bureaucracy, too much state, too much shared sovereignty, etc. And I think, this predates Trump, but you see it not just in places like Hungary, but you see it in the popularity of, for example, Marine Le Pen's party in France, or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. You see it with the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, politics is... Viktor Orban, sure, from this little country. But I mean, politics in these big countries is moving to the right. And I think we need to think about why.
But then again, if you don't have economic success, you also leave more people behind. You have a bigger group of people who are not participating in the system, who are not gaining from the system. So you lose domestically at the same time. Maybe
yes,
this is what we're seeing.
I totally agree with that. You have people who, are not doing badly, but comparatively are doing less well. And then combined with that, you have a big migration issue. And you have European countries that frankly had their ethnic cleansing 1,000 years ago. And are dealing with a post-World War II, post-colonial immigration. It's not just 2015, but people from North Africa, for the French from Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, the Turks in Germany, Vietnamese guest workers. You have all kinds of people. And then you had the big wave from Afghanistan and Syria.
Sure.
And it's had a big political impact because, people are struggling to figure out how to pay for everything. There are towns where there aren't enough school places, there aren't enough hospitals or doctors because no one was planning on this big an immigration. And then, of course, at the same time, you have an aging population. Europeans are not having children, or they're not having enough children. I mean, it's really pretty amazing. So that you need immigration. The Germans,
but you don't want it.
But you don't want it, or you don't know how to deal with it. And you have societies that are struggling. I mean, everyone has goodwill, I think, but they're struggling to figure out how everybody fits in. And I think this is one of the great political problems.
I think one of the arguments when you talk about migration is, and some people argue that quite forcefully, they say, look, migration is always a game of numbers. Because to truly integrate someone into your society, unless it's someone who is very close to your own society, and there are success stories, but it's a numbers game. If you have 5,000, you might be able to integrate them. If it's 500,000, probably not possible.
I mean, I've talked to Swedes. Sweden was a very popular place, along with Germany. They say it takes 6 to 7 years to integrate someone. That's a long time, and it's expensive. And then you see, let's say in Britain, I covered Brexit, right? Now, what drove Brexit in part was migration, but it wasn't Islam. It was white Christians from Poland, from the Baltics.
And still.
But the numbers became so large because Britain had, when these countries joined the European Union, did not put restrictions on their migration, which some other countries did. So you had the phenomenon of the Polish plumber and so on. But you go to a town, let's say Boston, England, where you had this huge Polish city next to the British city, Polish schools, Polish grocery stores, Polish language. And the pro-Brexit people did very well in places like that because people felt that their own identity was being diluted, not that they didn't have, it's not like they didn't like the Polish neighbors and all the rest of it, but it didn't feel like their town anymore. And you see this in East Germany also, in the former East Germany, where if you remember, I mean, I covered the Soviet bloc. Nobody immigrated to the Soviet bloc. If they could get out. And so suddenly now you have in these countries that are part of the EU and part of NATO, you have immigration for the first time. And they're not sure how to deal with it. And not only immigration, some of it is young Muslim men who do not necessarily share the values that the Dutch share about gender equality and other issues. So it's a strain that we see making an impact on politics, and it's going to take quite a long time. Look, in America, I mean, we're still dealing with the problems of slavery. It takes a really long time.
Well, migration, a topic that has been with us for a number of years, will be with us for a number of years. Let me move on to a place where you spent some time doing your reporting in Moscow. So when were you in Moscow, and how did that feel at the time?
Well, I first went in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev first became General Secretary. So I got to see it before it all collapsed, which was fascinating because it was the end of the Brezhnev period. I mean, not much had changed. It felt like the Antipodes, like the other end of the earth. It just looked very much like the old movies. There wasn't a lot of light. I mean, there wasn't a lot of choice. If you went as a tourist, you had to be in a group. So when I was traveling there, I would always, every morning at my hotel, I would join some new group and say, I'm having breakfast with you, because it was the only way to have breakfast. People weren't giving you individual breakfasts right then. And so then I watched it all change and was in Moscow when the Soviet flag came down, Christmas 91. And
the worst day in history for Vladimir Putin, apparently.
Yes, he called it the, largest, biggest geostrategic catastrophe of that century. And in a way, I understood it. I was living there from 91 through 95. And you could see it. I mean, you could see the anger building. You could see the humiliation, that's for sure. Men were dying at huge rates from heart disease, partly from stress because they'd lost their jobs. They always drank a lot. But I mean, what changed was suddenly they couldn't provide for their families in the same way. There was quite a lot of shame. You had workers in the countryside who were, building around factory towns. They built everything, the town followed the factory.
Right.
And when the factories had nothing to do, you had workers who were wandering around or they were paid. I remember going, I can't remember the town, but the whole street was lined with people with towels because the factory made towels and they were being paid in towels and they were trying to sell their towels to earn money. So
visible decline.
Visible decline and visible anger. And I felt very much that Russia would never stay in those boundaries because they were artificial boundaries. And that Belarus, Ukraine, the old Russian world, Russian language world, that some change would happen. So I'm not terribly shocked by it. And I think Putin built very well on this notion of we can be important again, we can be strong again.
And that basically that touches a string that Russians like to hear, right?
Totally. Oh, totally. And Russians, I mean, going back to the Marquis de Custine, who wrote wonderful letters around the time of Tocqueville about Russia. I mean, people like an iron fist and an iron glove. I mean, they want strong government. They are terrified of chaos. And they felt chaos under Yeltsin and wild capitalism, which they called it, dichy capitalism. And Putin has restored a sense of order, sometimes in a very ugly way. But people do feel kind of more proud to be Russian. So I always made the analogy of Germany after 1918, where the First War ended with German troops still abroad, right? And the whole notion of what happened and the stab in the back and the Allies took advantage of Germany when it was weakest to impose the Versailles Treaty.
Right.
And so what was the next 20 years was revisionism, was an effort to restore what Germans felt should be theirs, whether you agreed or not. And in Russia, there's something very similar. People feel that the West, that NATO took advantage of Russia when it was at its weakest. And one of the reasons Putin is pushing back, I think, is he feels that this was a historical injustice. I mean, Putin has restored some pride, and he's selling this war as a defensive war against NATO encroachment and so on into our civilizational state, which he likes to talk about. But the fact of the matter is, Russia is comparatively economically small. It has economic problems. I think, the Russian people, I wouldn't say they like sacrificing for the Rodina, for the motherland, but it's part of the myth of being Russian. That's what they did in the Great Patriotic War. And Putin is trying to sell this as something similar. So I think the pressures on him are real, but not enough to stop the war. And obviously there are Russian businessmen and oligarchs who are unhappy, but who are trying to keep their heads and not be thrown out of windows. And so for the moment, one has, I think, because Trump is pushing it, and I respect Trump's effort to push it, to solve this. I wish he were doing it more efficiently or effectively, but the fact is, it is an ugly attritional war, and I think Putin himself would love to end it, but end it
on his terms.
On his terms, right? So we'll see. I mean, Ukraine has agency. Ukraine's not about to collapse either. I mean, my guess is this could go on for quite some time.
But where do you put Trump in this equation? He's trying, but does he really read Putin the way Putin should be read? Does he really understand? Does he really care enough to really force a solution? Or will he get bored at some point?
Trump, it's very hard. I can't get into his brain any more than into Putin's brain. I mean, Trump likes Putin. He respects him as a strong leader. Putin has also pushed the whole Western values thing. He's against gay marriage. I mean, he's
not woke.
He's very anti-woke. I mean, it's part of the way he sold himself to the Russians, restoring Russian orthodoxy. Trump likes a strong person who doesn't have to worry too much about the courts and about legislatures, and who also, carries weight in the world, which Putin does. And does so on the basis of a very small economy, a very big country. It's still, as we all know, 11 time zones, and it's very mineral rich. And people used to joke that it was a gas station with nuclear weapons. Right? It's still a gas station, but it's pretty powerful in its own right. And Europeans are rightly afraid of it. I mean, they are afraid that not just Putin, but Russia's ambitions go beyond Ukraine. You have very senior European defense and political people, not just from the Balts, saying, 3-4 years from now,
what's coming next?
What's coming next? So I don't think Trump gets that. It feels very far away, all this problem. Sure. I mean, he sees Ukraine as an obstacle to this great relationship he wants to have with Putin. And I think he's bought Putin's narrative that Ukraine is somehow artificial. He's hated Zelensky ever since 2017, when Zelensky got caught up in this first impeachment of Donald Trump. And I think, you get a sense from Trump, he's basically saying to the Europeans, look, it's your strategic problem. You pay for it.
Sure.
And be gracious enough to sell you weapons that you can give to the Ukrainians, but no more money from me. Now, as long as the Americans continue operational intelligence, which is crucial to Ukraine's defense, and keep supplying, air defense missiles, even if they're bought by other people, I think that's important. So far, Trump really, except for one brief moment when he was trying to pressure Zelensky, has kept up with that and is if he gets increasingly understanding that Vladimir Putin is not really interested in meeting Zelensky and not really interested in a ceasefire. We'll see what happens in the next month or so. But, I suspect he will continue this kind of support for Ukraine. Will he ever sanction Putin? It's hard to see.
Our show is called Conversation Changers. If there were any question where you say, look, I think this is really talked about it the wrong way, it should really be rather talked about this way, is there anything that springs to your mind?
I think there is a part of the Russian narrative that we need to actually understand, which is to admit that, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said about Russia and Ukraine, Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Russia without Ukraine might be a more normal state. So I think that's been at the heart of Western policy. We have been trying to seduce Ukraine. We have been trying to bring Ukraine into the West, even when under Yanukovych it was neutral. Now, I'm not saying this was malign, but seen from Moscow's point of view, the NATO offer in 2008 in Bucharest, when I was there, when it promised Ukraine and Georgia membership in NATO without specifying when or how, Putin's been trying to shut that door ever since. It took him 4 months to do it in Georgia. It's taken him this many years, but he does not want Ukraine to be Poland. He wants Ukraine to be Belarus. And I think we really need to take that seriously.
We'd better take this seriously. I thank you for the conversation. Steven Erlanger, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
In an age of polarized voices and reinforced views, be part of changing the conversation. Follow us on social media and visit us at salzburgglobal.org.